Hello, good evening, and welcome to this evening's YAPF event, Practice Architecture Well, with Dr. Jenny Russell. It's our third event in this year's Skills for Success series. And just before we start and I introduce Jenny this evening, I'd like to look forward to our final event in 2 weeks' time on the 25th of November at the same time as this evening. We're welcoming speakers from Foster's, from RIBA Architecture, and from Peter Barber Architects to talk about urban adaptation and new emerging urban environments in response to the pandemic. Tonight, though, we turn our attention to Dr. Jenny Russell. Dr. Jenny Russell is the Interim Director of Education at the RIBA, an experienced academic leader and being involved in architectural education for more than 20 years. Previously the head of school at Ulster University, and the last few years she has provided support to several schools around the country on a consultancy basis. Jenny's been an external examiner at several different unis around the school, and prior to taking up her role at the RIBA was the active chair of the validation panel and the new courses group. Jenny's interests lie in the spatial perceptions of children and their engagement with architecture and the built environment. And most recently, she has written 2 support guides, one for students and one for early career architects, focusing on working competently while maintaining good mental health. The latter of which is the topic for this evening. The guide, which has been published for free through the RIBA, Practice Architecture Well, will form the basis of this evening's talk. A wide-ranging look at emerging professions and young professionals and their experiences. So without further ado, Jenny, I'd like to hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Andy. Good evening, everyone. It's really good to be with you this evening, and I want to thank Andy for the invitation. I'm Jenny Russell. As Andy has said, I'm Director of Education at the RIBA, and I took up this post in July. My role there really involves providing strategic direction in the development of architectural education and acting as an advocate for it. Andy's done much of my first paragraph tonight, but I'll maybe introduce myself again, partly because it ties in with really what some of the points that I want to make later on in my talk tonight. I am an academic, and I've been involved in architectural education for my entire working career. Most recently, I was the associate head at Ulster. And prior to that, I led the Part 1, I've led the Part 2 and been the professional studies advisor. But I came out of that about 5 years ago, and I had the opportunity to spend some time with my young family, seeing them grow up a little bit, and I worked then part-time, offering consultancy to schools of architecture, particularly new schools, as they tried to set up their courses, trying to encourage them in that. Research-wise, so these are some of my old students. Research-wise, I'm particularly interested in the spatial perceptions of children and their engagement with architecture and the built environment. And that was really the focus. In fact, if you see in this slide, I'm the one in the white t-shirt. It was really my focus when I was studying, particularly at Part 2. I found the way that children engaged with the built environment really, really interesting, and so much so that I continued that into a PhD. I find what they say in their drawings of space particularly fascinating, and the amount that they understand their environment. But that's for another talk. But I'm going to maybe pick up on some of those a little bit later on. So that's what I do. But in saying all of that, and in the context of my talk tonight, I want to tell you just a little bit about who I am. I'm a wife, I'm a mother. These are my 2 crazies in the middle here. I'm a daughter, I'm a friend. I'm from Belfast. Here it sits in the shadow of the Harland and Wolff Cranes. I sing in a gospel choir. My faith is important to me. I own a dog, that's Basil. I love to paint. I like holidaying in Donegal. I like musical theatre, good food and good comedy. So I've told you a bit about what I do and also about who I am. And I'm not trying to be over familiar, but it's just hopefully that will actually underpin what I'm going to talk about tonight. And I'll come back round to that again later on. Andy approached me to speak to you because I've just finished, as he said, writing a pair of guides, the Architecture Well guides for the RIBA, which really focus on studying and practicing architecture well. And we thought that they would be a good foundation to talk about soft skills, to talk about wellness. But I suppose, what do we mean? What do I mean by practicing architecture well? Well, the word well has a number of different meanings. It can mean in a good or satisfactory way, in a thorough manner, or in good health, or free from recovered from illness. And although well-being is something which there is really a far greater awareness of today than, say, even 5 years ago, it's something which in architecture we can be particularly vulnerable to. You will have seen these sorts of cartoons, they're all over the place, where architecture is treated like some kind of disease that has symptoms, and they can be really funny, but they can also reflect a means of practice which is really anything but healthy. And so in particular this evening, I want to think a little bit about what you do, what it means to work ethically and competently, but also to think about how you look after yourself while dealing with the pressures that come with practicing architecture. One of the areas is actually one of legacy and of example and culture, and what that means in the context of practice, particularly how you influence and encourage each other. So perhaps we could start with the question, why are you here? I don't mean why are you here to listen to my talk, although I'm very grateful that you've turned up. I mean, why are you practicing architecture? Please don't think that I'm trying to be condescending or patronising or even naive. I just think it's a good starting point to get us into this topic. I'm guessing that when you started to think about architecture, that you did so because ultimately you wanted to be an architect. But did you really understand what you were signing up for when you started? I know that I didn't. Maybe your view of what an architect does has changed. Perhaps it doesn't live up to expectations, or perhaps it exceeds them. Perhaps you're starting to see directions or doors that are opening towards specialisation. Maybe you'd love to push the boundaries of research and aren't quite sure how to do that when you're in practice. Maybe you'd like to push the door of teaching or even doing reviews for universities and you don't know where to start. But wherever you're at in your relationship with architecture, in terms of thinking about soft skills, sometimes the best starting point, I think, is to go back to basics and reflect on that. When I speak to students of architecture and what it means to be an architect, I talk to them about value. And in the guides, we describe the architect's role to being one that strategizes, designs, oversees the construction of buildings and other built assets to create value. And value is one of those words which, like well, can mean a lot of different things. We often attribute it to finance and cost and the value of what you're doing and what you're creating, and how that value can be attributed to a building. But it's so much more than that. We can think of what value your buildings, your designs may have to a community, what experiential value you might be creating, or social value. And sometimes in the thick of it, that value can be forgotten. You forget what you're actually achieving. And you may think that you're a small link in a chain, but actually in a chain, every single link's important. And while the poetic and maybe rose-tinted overview of being an architect that you might have had as a student might be over, there's other challenges that you face at the minute that actually you might find you enjoy and you really thrive on. However, there's huge complexities involved in what you do. And when we think about mental well-being, part of dealing with that is actually the recognition of what you do and the difficulty that it brings. So it's important that we don't belittle it and make less of it than we should. So we've talked about value. I also want to talk about the word just. To be told that it's just another drawing or just another report, but it's just this or just that. In the context of everything that you do, the word just can be hugely significant. And we sometimes question why we can struggle to do something when it's just whatever. As architects, we can sometimes belittle the complexity of what it is that we do. In fact, Hawkins Brown's architects on their reception desk in London have this printed. They say, "We're Hawkins Brown, architects, designers, master planners, researchers, space planners, interior designers, collaborators, makers, negotiators, artists, visualizers, and problem solvers." And as a student, you're learning and developing to do all of those things that you then take into practice. It takes huge amounts of knowledge and skill to translate a brief into a completed building, not just being logical and technical, but also creative and three-dimensional. Because as architects, you're not only, I suppose, satisfying the wishes of your clients, complying with regulations, on time, to budget, but also creating things which look good, which add social and cultural value, and more critically respond to the needs of the environment. And many of our world's major challenges, so population growth, urbanization, migration, climate change, the depletion of resources, social inequality, they're all mediated in some way by the multi-trillion-dollar industry that we are a part of. And we've got a part to play in that. And acting ethically is integral to that role. Once qualified, ethics affect everything. They affect the fees you charge, your impact on budget, your attitude to risk, your response to the client brief, project procurement, where your products come from, the well-being of your future building users, the building's impact on the local community, even what will happen to your building at the end of its life. And you're required to understand how people function and behave and respond by designing appropriately. But you might also be required to then challenge current behaviour and how people actually use buildings. Your work directly addresses the climate emergency. The built environment's responsible for at least 40% of our carbon footprint. And it's going to take huge challenge and creativity to achieve net zero carbon emissions. You also need to think about health, safety and well-being. And I know tonight I'm also going to be talking about your mental well-being, but you have to think about the well-being of others as you design. The spaces that you design directly impact on the well-being of your users. We spend more than 80% of our lives inside, which can affect our mood both positively and negatively. And the quality of the places in which we live and work and study impacts on our levels of happiness. I'm particularly interested in the ethics of spatial response. And I mentioned earlier that my research interest lies in the field of spatial perception, and in particular the perceptions of children. And although it might be deviating slightly from, I suppose, practicing architecture well, I thought I might just take a few moments to share a couple of the thoughts from my PhD. It took me 3 years. I'll try to compress them into 3 or 4 minutes. But from my research, I developed a premise that children perceive spaces differently to adults, which is, I suppose, following on from me talking about the kind of ethics of spatial response. Because children tend to work primarily in a different part of their brain when they are understanding space. And so that spatial experience and arrangement can have a profound impact on a child's ability to understand space. So I took this premise and I applied it to 2 case studies. I used school buildings and that differed in terms of their spatial arrangement. One was a very clearly defined sequence of closed spaces. The diagram was really simple. I'll show you it in a minute. And one was much more kind of visually open, much more difficult to draw, as it were. And then I used a series of methodologies which included drawings and interviews and observations. This is Craigar Park Primary School in Edinburgh. And to be fair, no matter which direction you look in Craigar Park, it looks pretty much like this. It's white walls with a suspended ceiling and closed doors. And so if we look at the plan on the left-hand side, it's very simple as a diagram. The blue space is staff accommodation. The green space, the big space in the middle, is the assembly hall, and then there's changing facilities beside it. To the left-hand side of that, the yellow space is the dining hall and the kitchens. The orange spaces are ancillary classrooms, and the red spaces are the main classroom facilities, a block for the junior children and a block for the senior. And all I asked the children was to draw me the space inside their school. I used exactly the same question in both schools that I went to. And what I found really fascinating, and I did this over and over again in a number of different classes, I spoke to about 80 primary school children in each, that this was the drawing of not just one of the children, but I got similar drawings to this from kids from different classes. There was no discussion between them, but simply they took a ruler and separated their page into boxes and filled in the spaces. And it was really interesting to see that their experience of the school and how they built a mental map of the space was reflected in a series of boxes, and they couldn't connect the dots. And it became very obvious that those closed doors, those doors which separated the spaces, were a real block in terms of the children trying to understand the space in their school. In this example from Craigar Park, the child in question has used the edges of the page as the container and has simply thrown all of the different elements into it. Again, not quite sure how to relate them all together. In contrast, this is Woodley Primary School. It's really difficult to photograph, but there's a central space which you can see in the photo on the left-hand side, which is their library. And then there are ramps which take you down to classroom blocks off the library itself, off the kind of main concourse of the school. And if you see the plan, much as it's got the same type of accommodation, the blue is where the staff are, the green is the assembly hall, The yellow is the kitchen. They use the dining hall, the assembly hall for their dining room. The orange are the ancillary spaces, and then the red are the classrooms. Now, the child who drew the drawing beside it is exactly the same age as the one who drew the previous one with all of the box that was separated into boxes. And I think it's just incredible to see that the spatial perception and understanding of the children can be so different. And for children, you can, when you watch how they engage with the space and how they run up and down the ramps and how they can see the moment they come into the school, the link between the different classes, it's really fantastic. Again, this is a child who has created the outdoor, the external kind of container for the school, but here the main space in the middle has everything around it in the locations that it should be. And please forgive me for kind of jumping in to this to tell you a little bit about that, but I think as we have a responsibility and as architects have a responsibility to design competently, I think to look at how children draw the space that they're experiencing is really, really interesting. But let's segue from designing for good mental well-being of building users and how you act ethically as an architect to talking about mental health and what it means for architects and students working in practice. So my point, if you can kind of round up everything I've said so far, is that undertaking architecture, whether in practice or as a student, is really difficult. You've not chosen an easy route. So let's talk a little bit about how to keep well. Well, my experience is primarily with students. In general, the pressures that architects and students face are universal. For example, pressures of finance. I've seen those with significant financial problems and those who have small financial problems. I've talked to students who are managing to undertake a 40-hour-a-week job to support their families when there's been redundancy faced by their parents and their homes are at risk, all the while trying to manage a full-time architecture degree. And I know the significant burden of student loans that those in practice are carrying following so many years as a student. And those cases might be one end of the scale, but it doesn't stop those who might have perhaps smaller financial worries from having the burden that stress provides. There's emotional stress that we face, or the stress that might come from families, family separation, family difficulties. I've talked with students who find themselves homeless. And lots of people carry illness or disability, many of which are hidden. Then there's grief and dealing with that. And in all of that, what I would say is that comparison can be a significant factor to our mental health. We can compare how we deal with things to either the burdens that other people carry, and we belittle our own burdens, or we compare how others have responded to a similar situation and beat ourselves up for not coping as well. So in the first instance, much like the note says, you know, we tend to have something that goes on inside our head at times that tell us to keep quiet. But please try not to compare yourself to others and how you're coping with situations, because we're all entirely different. Sometimes we need to challenge what's going on in our own heads. Now, as far as I can gather from talking with Andy and Amy, I think there's probably quite a broad range of people here. Some might still be at uni, some are still students but working in practice, and some of you have moved beyond your time at university. and are practicing as architects. But I think it's helpful to recognise that whatever stage you're at, you're involved in a subject area that crosses humanities, arts and sciences, where you're expected to be successful at calculations and technology, at writing and theoretical thought, or report writing and presentation of bids, and design, creative practice, and visual and verbal presentation. It's a fairly broad spectrum of skills. And all too often, and I would say particularly at university, to those of you who are still studying, we find ourselves in a position where we think we need to be the best at all of those things, because we have an education system where value and success are determined by marks. And the truth is that actually, while we need to be competent, to draw on a word from my first half, more often than not, we'll end up working collaboratively in teams where there's a broad range of skill sets, and the best teams function where the right people are doing the right things. However, the pressure that we feel, not only from work, but also from ourselves, can be significant, particularly when we struggle with some of these areas. And it's particularly difficult because almost always, rather than right or wrong answers, whether you're a student or you're in practice, there are merely better or worse ways of approaching things. And this is sometimes hard to stomach because the vast majority of us seek assurance of whether something is right or wrong. And I hugely applaud practices who work on building the confidence, or rather building confidence into their younger members of staff as they try to grasp ownership of their own work. And this is one of the points that I mentioned at the start, where I talked about legacy and responsibility to the generations who are following behind us. I mean the nurturing of those younger than you in a practice, because they need your support and your guidance. And so I would suggest that learning the skills to understand and manage the pressure is as virtually as important as actually undertaking the work. Very few people make their way through architecture, whether it's work or study, without feeling stretched at some point. Now, it might be the outside pressures, like I've talked about, or it might be a mixture, or it might be the work itself, or it might be a mixture of both. But often we find it's those pressures of work which ultimately can make us unstuck. And coping with stress takes mental resilience. To some people, and you'll find it frustrating at times, the self-confidence and mental resilience needed to cope comes really easily, almost as if they were born to it. But to others, and I think, truth be told, most of us, it can seem getting that self-confidence or that resilience can sometimes seem almost out of reach, triggering stress and anxiety as we grapple with uncertainty. And we soldier on anyway, because a course or deadlines demand it. Although the majority of people overcome, I've slipped forward there. Although the majority of people overcome these difficulties and then build strategies that are required to deal with them, for some they are more significant. And stress can be good, but in fact, and I would say that you'd all probably agree that at times you need stress. It helps motivate you to focus and to deliver. But stress can also be bad. It's the main gateway to mental ill health, especially things like anxiety and depression, which themselves can kind of set up a self-reinforcing pattern that can affect every part of your life. One of the problems with stress and issues of mental health generally is that we find it really difficult to identify it in ourselves, or that we're reluctant to admit to admit that it's there or that we're struggling to cope. And also, because we're aware that stress can be useful, how can we know when it's becoming unhealthy? Let me illustrate it by talking to you about how our brains function. I didn't take very long at drawing this guy. But I would say that if you have lots of kind of understanding of neurology, please excuse what I'm about to show you as a diagram of your brain. So this is my diagram of the brain. And I've put beside it a graph that tracks stress and time. So I tried to turn this person into an architect. I thought I'd try to do something. So in the brain, I've given this person 3 different layers, 3 different sections, and I've got that the same kind of 3 levels or layers in the graph. So when we are happy, things are fine, we aren't feeling under stress, we're living in that yellow part of the brain. It's the way we function. It's our normal mode of practice. Now, imagine that you're walking along a path, you're enjoying the scenery, and there's no issues whatsoever. The next stage, the next level in your brain is a point where it's being prepared or being ready for something to happen. So it's stepping up, feeling slightly stressed, feeling slightly more anxious. Imagine you hear a set of footsteps behind you as you walk along this path. There's nothing to worry about. They're still there. They're steady. There's no issue, but you're aware of them. And you just can hear that they're there behind you. Now, when we get into that top level of stress, that red part of the brain, it's when adrenaline kicks in, and our brains are responding. It pushes us forward to meet whatever difficulty it is that we have found ourselves stressed to face. The footsteps, somebody has started to run behind you, and you can feel the panic. So it's that moment where you think you need action, you need to do something. So that's normal. We all need feel stress at different points in our lives. And then what should naturally happen is we move back down into that normal modus operandi, that part of yellow part of the brain, that part where everything's fine and we aren't coping under stress. And in life, generally, we have moments when we're stressed and moments when we're not. And we reach that peak because the adrenaline kicks in and it helps us to function. Now, the danger of stress is when we end up living in that high part of our brain that all the time. It becomes an issue when we're living with that adrenaline surge. It turns into anxiety when persistent or excessive or irrational feelings and behaviours stay with you even if there isn't a cause. The symptoms being things like insomnia, difficulty concentrating, muscle fatigue, panic attacks. And that's where we need to think about how we can get ourselves out of that full-time stress that we're under. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Because before I do that, I want to address the all-nighter. It's the quintessential badge of honour that's known to any university student when asked what architecture students do. Oh, architecture students do all-nighters. And it doesn't stop at university. I know it isn't uncommon for them to happen in practice. And I want to think for a minute about the reasons why we need sleep. At a basic level, we can be groggy. Our functioning, particularly our reactions, can be impaired. So think about driving home from the office after an all-nighter and what that might, the danger that that could have. We have less energy. It's harder to make decisions, but more so we can make risky decisions. We can binge on food or alcohol. We can start to hallucinate. And now I recognise that there are times when pressure is high, and worse still, there are pressures for our employers to work until something is complete. But the longer we go without sleep, the less able we are to have the capacity to recognise when we're actually doing useful work. So I want to just again return to what I said about this at the start about legacy, example and culture, and what that means in the context of architecture, particularly how you influence each other. The all-nighter is not a badge of honour. It shouldn't be seen as winning at what you're doing. If you're being asked to do it, and perhaps I said unfairly, but I think there's something wrong. By ignoring our body's need for sleep, you're putting yourself at risk, and your ability to function starts to decrease. You're putting yourself in a vulnerable state for your mental health to suffer. And we've seen that stress can be good, but like the guy with fully red brain, under extreme and prolonged stress, your body will simply respond and your ability to be productive will decrease. So the only way to break that cycle is to recognise and prioritise well-being, that those who are more senior in their journeys model good working practice. I know that in universities, it tends to be handed down from generation to generation of architecture students. And in order to improve mental health and well-being, we need to actively discourage it in those we influence. So that's maybe my doom and gloom side of things. But I don't want to finish on the problems. I want to talk to you about solutions and what we can do about it. And it comes down to self-care. So remember when I introduced myself, I maybe overshared, but I tried to introduce myself to you not in terms just of my working life, but also in terms of what I do outside of that. That what I do, what is vitally important is who you are and not just what you do. And I think in architecture, sometimes those can be shifted. And that actually reflecting on the wider person and giving all those other things that make up who you are value. Come back to that word value again. It's not just about the value that you create for other people, but actually you need to give those things that you have that are outside of architecture value. We're fairly rubbish, I think, as a profession at attributing ourselves with the same dedicated focus to value and valuing who we are. What I do, I sing, I walk the dog, I take time to cook something properly. I take my girls into town and take them out for hot chocolate. My husband, well, he would wax lyrical about the medicinal qualities of having a lovely bath. In our work, then, how do we reflect on good practice in this way? Now, some of these may sound simple, but actually, they're maybe not. Try to set a realistic plan for getting through your work that builds in breaks, that builds in some form of social life. And it's not even, you know, I don't joke by putting in things like sleeping, eating and drinking, because I've so often seen architecture students who forget to do all three. Set yourself daily targets. Manage your progress against your plan. Time management's really critical. And if you find that you're not meeting those targets, you then need to reassess them. And I'll come down to ask for help in a minute, but if you're not managing to do that, asking for help in how to do that is really important. Don't be embarrassed to do that. Carefully monitor and manage distractions. Appraise how much time you spend on distractions and figure out ways to control it. Maybe reflect on your Instagram scrolling. I know that Instagram scrolling for me can just eat time. And actually, what I would say is it can have a real stranglehold on your self-worth. Past a certain point, the effort that you put in ceases in any way to yield any form of worthwhile return. And you need to learn to build consciously how to recognize when you've reached that point. I've said it a number of times. Ask for help from others without hesitation, no matter how stupid the question that you think you're asking is, because undoubtedly there will be other people who are thinking the same thing. When I give lectures to students, I will always ask them in lectures to ask the questions that they feel are stupid, because there will be at least half of a class who will be thinking the same thing and be feeling embarrassed about asking. Ask for help as early as possible. Don't keep pushing it. I'm a procrastinator. I have a habit, if I don't know what to do, I will set it aside, and then it'll just build and build and build, and then it'll dramatically affect me because I have to do something at the last minute. You know, I'm aware that that's one of my real flaws when I'm working, and I actively try to do the hardest thing at the start of the day rather than the easiest thing. For those of you possibly more so students, unless you're working with them as a team, have the integrity and the wisdom to ignore what your peers are doing. If those around you appear to be doing better than you, however you define it, bear two things in mind. First, appearances can be entirely misleading, and secondly, everyone is different and has skills in different areas. And what I would say is we all get things wrong. You know, so we will make mistakes. One of the reasons that I'm so passionate about this is that 5 years ago, I told you at the start that I took some time out of work to raise my young family. Well, truth be told, I came out of work because I had a mental breakdown. And to be honest, for the first 6 months, I'd no real ability or capacity to look after them in any way. Getting from my bed to the sofa was a big enough challenge, and that's hard to explain or to picture if it's not something that you've experienced. On reflection, I had had a workload that was far greater than anyone would reasonably, or that far greater than anything that would reasonably be undertaken by one person. And I'd been ill for a really, really long time, but I hadn't been willing or able to recognise it or have the capacity to put things in place to rectify it. I'd been ignoring some fairly critical physical symptoms, some of which put me in A&E, thinking that I'd had a stroke. And when the doctors told me that I was suffering from significant stress, I went straight back to work. And I remember vividly having a conversation with a colleague who said to me, Jenny, I tend to see people in colours, and usually you're a bright sunshine yellow, but at the minute you're sludge brown or even black. And there's something about being told that you're sludge brown that's not a good thing. There was something about those words that really pushed me over the edge of a cliff. And the following day, I found myself unable to literally cross the threshold of our house. Again, it's very hard to explain, but I couldn't move. I needed help. I got it. I spent a year visiting a psychiatrist. My husband was entirely amazing, and it's taken me time to come back from that point, and I'll always carry those scars. To be fair, I never thought that I would work full-time again, and I know I find myself in the position that I'm in at the moment. My brain now responds differently in those situations than it used to, where I talked about naturally your adrenaline kicks in and you go to action or you fight in something. I now run the other way. I literally now will get up and run out, leave a room. It's a really strange sensation to have that change in how I react to stress. And so I now need to manage my stress levels really carefully, but I've now got an awareness of them. So I have been scarred by what happened, but I believe that in some ways it probably needed to happen, because otherwise I would have just pushed and pushed and pushed. I've come out the other side a different person, and I have a story that I can share, because so many other people have stories that they aren't even aware of. I've maybe come out a different person, and I might be a slightly different shade of yellow, but I do feel like I'm back to being me. So I want to finish this evening by asking you to do 3 things. And even though we're here and ultimately the topic is architecture, I'm not really going to ask you to do anything architectural. So my 3 things are these. Please look out for one another. Show kindness. Remember that others around you might be in a situation that you know nothing about. Don't be afraid to ask for help. I keep saying it. Architecture is hard. Life can be really hard. And sometimes, and for all of us at different times, we need support. It may be as simple as not understanding what you're meant to be doing. Or it may be that tonight this has maybe been a little bit too close for comfort, and that you've had to maybe reflect back to yourself the fact that things are maybe not okay, but please ask for help. And if that's the case, please see your doctor, talk to a friend, a counsellor, or your boss. And finally, don't lose who you are because of what you do. Remember, it's who you are that's ultimately the most important thing. And while what you do is great, who you are is more important. I'm going to leave up the guides, and that's the link at the bottom. To be fair, if you Google RIBA Study Architecture Well or RIBA Practice Architecture Well, it should come up as the first part of the of Google itself. So thank you so much. I hope that's been useful.
Jenny, thank you so much first and foremost. We have got a little bit of time for some questions at the end. I just wanted to say firstly, thank you for the talk and thank you for being so frank, honest and open. One of the first things that I wrote down in my notes there was about how you introduced yourself as a human rather than an architect, and I think that's a lesson for us all to take away, but it has stolen one of my questions, so I'm slightly annoyed about that. Just on the kind of the end of your talk there was very, very serious, very heartfelt. I just wanted to touch on some kind of practical tips for spotting this in both yourself and in others. I've had a first question through as well to say, what would you recommend to say to a colleague who you notice is beginning to change colour, to use the kind of the terminology that you used? Where would you point them to? What are the tips for looking inwards and looking outwards?
I think that's an amazing question, actually, and so counsellors and psychiatrists that I've spoken to from my personal side of things would talk about how talking is probably the fundamental, most important side of things, and asking sensitive questions, to ask if somebody's doing okay, to say that they maybe aren't quite themselves, to suggest to them that you notice that they don't have the same spark. So I think those are sensitive ways of approaching it, but at the same time, that they are also they're open-ended questions, because they then give people the opportunity to share if they want to. And if your colleague or whoever isn't willing to share any of that, it might be worth then just saying, if there are problems, you know, maybe try to find some help. There's a whole series of resources at the back of the Practice Architecture Well guide, which hopefully would be of use. So some of those might be a good starting point, but actually an open-ended question, an ear, a cup of coffee, and finding some time where you can sit somebody down and just gently ask how they're feeling. I don't think anybody will be offended by being asked. You know, you might not get a response that you want. Somebody might cry, but actually opening up that conversation with gentle questions and a cup of coffee, I think, is probably the best starting point.
That's great. I think some of those resources that are in the back of the guide, Architects Mental Wellbeing Forum, CALM, the kind of charities, NHS guides. We have, in the practice that I work in, we have a series of kind of mental health first aiders, which were mental health first aid courses. Really, really useful training, and you know, we try to look out for people in the practice as best we can. It's difficult, and you talk about the one more thing, the just it's a just in our roles within the practice. It's an extra thing that we look at, and that takes, you know, us to keep that up as well. I think a lot of the things that you touched on were boiled down to the fact that people suffer these things on their own. Mm-hmm. And that a lot of people have very, very similar experiences without ever realizing that they're actually one of many rather than just themselves. I wondered if you had any thoughts on kind of collectivism and what that means for a profession which holds up individualism as the kind of the thing to be heralded most.
Again, I think that's really interesting. I think as it's an interesting thing, because academically and at university, and when people are studying architecture, it's very much about the individual. And the difference when you go into practice is so often you're working in huge teams on what you do. And I think that if there's I would love to see more opportunity for that teamwork and that sense of how you're meant to work collectively together down into the universities. It doesn't align with how institutions tend to work and to mark and to grade. And I know that in recent years there's been more and more joint thesis projects and things that are coming through where there is some teamwork. There are team projects that go on, but it's still in the minority. It's still very much about the individual. And so I think there's probably a way to go within the education system. I talked about legacy and that kind of journey that students go on and that you go into practice with, and looking to the people above you and the influence of people above you. And you know, it's going to be a generational change I don't think it's a quick change, but I think with practices actually actively looking into mental health, having mental health first aiders, I think that's a big step.
Yeah, no, that's great. The idea of legacy, I think, is the last thing that I wanted to touch on. We had an email around quite recently asking to judge a student competition at a university, where the deadline, the information was released on Saturday morning, and the submission was Monday morning. And we've kind of pointed out that maybe that's not the most healthy way of organising their work. I think it's just tips for young professionals, especially who perhaps have gone through that culture and come out into a practice culture, which is one of handing down the kind of having to work hard for the right to progress in a practice. Tips especially for young professionals on how in that power structure they can remain professional in holding their ground.
That's a really hard question, Andy. I think in terms of holding your ground, being professional, I suppose the things that I talked about at the end of the talk, time management and working through the process of time management with perhaps those younger than you in the practice, to actually to be able to ask questions about good time management. From all that I hear from talking to people, from being an academic, when you have practitioners or students who ask intelligent questions, I think there's a level of respect that comes from that. And so for a young practitioner to ask a more senior practitioner for help and advice in something along the lines of time management or some of those skills that you need to have, actually, I've never known somebody to not respect being asked that question, because actually at its heart, it's probably one of the best questions that you can be asked, because whoever the person asking the question is, they actually want to improve something that's really critical in practice. So I take time management as an example, but actually asking questions shouldn't be seen as a thing which highlights that which you don't know. Asking questions should be seen as a way of improving how you work. And if more senior practitioners don't respect those sort of questions being asked, I think that's more the issue is more on them than on those young practitioners, because by asking questions, you're taking control of what you do and you're wanting to improve. For me, that shows maturity. And I apply the same kind of thoughts when I teach, that for students who ask questions, it's much better to have students who ask questions than those who don't say anything. It's about engaging and wanting to improve. If that answers your question?
I think that does, and I think that's probably a really, really good point to leave on this evening. I think we've had a comment just to thank you for the guides, which I would like to to bring your attention to, saying that this person's been asked to talk to children's friends who have an interest in architecture and they found it difficult to be enthusiastic at times, but it said that the guides that you've published have been a real help in that. So I would stress to our attendees to go and have a look at them. Don't just look at the one that applies to you. If you're a student, look at the practice one. If you're in practice, look at the student one, because there's definitely things in both of them that are incredibly useful. For now then, I'd just like to say once again, Dr. Jenny Russell, thank you very much for your time this evening. Thanks to all our attendees. Please do join us again in 2 weeks' time for Urban Adaptation. Tickets are still available through the Eventbrite link. If you pop that into Google, I'm sure you'll find that. But for now, thank you very much for your attendance and have a good evening.